Okay, so in the last lecture we looked at Bostrom's argument for thinking we're in a simulation. So in this one I want to go through his argument premise by premise and see how acceptable we find them. Going to get more into detail into that in the next one. We'll go through some of the premises in this one, the remaining premises in the other. All right, so before we do that, we should actually look at the premises of Bostrom's argument. A good simulation of the conscious mind would probably be conscious. A sufficiently technologically advanced civilization could almost certainly create such simulations. They probably would create such simulations. Civilizations are likely to last long enough to reach this point of technological advancement, to the point where they could create simulations. If that's true, then most worlds will be simulations. And since most worlds are simulations, our world is probably one as well. Now, with an inductive argument, the conclusion can't be more likely than the premises. So, premises, conclusion can't be more likely than they are. So how likely do we think the premises are? Remember I said the main ones here are 1 through 4. What probability do we assign to 1 through 4? Bostrom seems to assign a very, very high degree of probability to all but 4. He thinks, well, hopefully civilizations won't blow themselves up before they get really technologically advanced, but, I'm not really sure. 1 through 3, he seems pretty sure about. Simulation of the conscious mind is going to be conscious. Technologically advanced civilization could create, simulations. They probably would do it. 4, he's less sure about. How sure are we of 4? What evidence do we have about how likely this is or not? Civilizations are likely to last long enough to reach this point, the point where, advanced simulations are possible of technological advancement. What are the odds that a civilization destroys itself before they get to this point? So we certainly haven't gotten there yet, but think of the stuff we've already had to get through that could have wiped us out, right? Asteroids could hit the Earth. They have in the past. If one hit big enough, they think an asteroid or comet killed off the dinosaurs. A big enough one would have a pretty good odds of killing all of us too, right? Nuclear war, not just, the people who would be killed in a nuclear war. It turns out nuclear war also really messes up the environment. So guess what? If we had a nuclear war, there's a pretty good chance that it would render the environment such that it couldn't support life. That would be it for all of us, right? Then there's the kinds of things that we might invent in the future, right? Hostile artificial intelligence, right? Again, a sci-fi trope, machines bent on wiping us out, Terminator, The Matrix, all those. But a lot of smart people, Bostrom being one of them, takes this seriously, right? That will invent computers smart enough to be conscious and to think on their own, and that they might decide they don't have much use for us. Finally, bioweapons, right? Most naturally occurring diseases simply aren't going to be bad enough to wipe us all out, right? Even the worst of them, right? The Black Death in Europe killed about 1/3 of the population, which is terrible, which is unimaginable human tragedy to live through. I can't even think of what that would possibly be like. Living through it would be terrible, just the losing people, the fear. But as nightmarish as it is, 1/3 is not 100%, right? So it seems really unlikely that any naturally occurring disease is going to wipe everybody out, right? And with the Black Death, there were parts of the world it didn't even happen in, right? So, but what might be able to wipe people out, we as a species might engineer a disease that's nastier than any of the natural ones, right? Governments might do this to create a weapon. The US and Russia both, especially Russia during the Cold War, created a lot of biological agents. A country might do this, then lo and behold, it might get out and kill a lot of people, right? Russians actually did this more than we did. Nixon actually ended the U.S. biological weapons program for the most part in the 70s. Actually seemed to think that, biological weapons were just too terrible for the U.S. to be involved with, morally outraged, and stopped the program. So it's kind of hard, maybe if you know much about Richard Nixon, to picture him having this idealistic moment of like, goodness, these weapons are too terrible, we shouldn't have them. But he actually did, right? So people are complicated. Anyway, somebody still might create more of these. They might get out. It's getting easier and easier to create, things through genetic engineering. It might be to the point, some point in the future, that just one mentally disturbed person on their own or a small group of them create something. That might be something to worry about. So for all these reasons, of all the premises, Bostrom is probably the least certain about 4. But Bostrom would say, well, look, when it comes to 4, either one of two things is true. Either civilizations are prone to wiping themselves out, in which case, well, the future looks very dark, or they're not. If they're not prone to wiping themselves out, then we're probably living in a simulation. If they are, well, we're probably all going to die, or the world will. So Bostrom would say, well, I don't know, but you should at least hope the one that makes it likely you're living in a simulation is likely. Anyway, we'll move on from 4, though. Let's talk about the others. So premise 2. A sufficiently technologically advanced civilization could almost certainly create such simulations. Is this true or not? If civilizations advance, are they going to get to the point where they can create these incredibly realistic, simulations that simulate human consciousness and entire worlds? I don't know. I'm a little less optimistic. I'm a little less convinced of this than Bostrom is. I'm no expert, but computing power has grown very, very quickly, and it continues to grow pretty quickly. On the other hand, again, I'm no expert, but from what I can tell, even though the power of computers is still increasing and doing it pretty quickly, the rate at which it's increasing has slowed down and has continued to slow down in recent years. And now look, it's not impossible. Bostrom would say, well, even if it keeps slowing down, it's going to keep getting better and better, and eventually at some point, it might just take longer than I thought, but at some point it's going to get good enough. I'm not sure about that. For all we know, our progress with computers and computing power might just hit a wall or stall out, right? Sorry, I mixed my metaphors here, stalling out, hitting a wall, different metaphors, so sue me. But anyway, point being, it might get to a certain point and stop. And now look, this has happened with a lot of technologies. They reach a certain point, and they just don't seem to develop very much after that, right? The basic physical design of jets hasn't changed a whole lot in the last 30 or 40 years, right? You're watching a movie from the 60s and they have a jet in it, a commercial jet. They look pretty much the same, the stuff under the hood. There's been some incremental changes, but the same basic design, right? You know, other technologies, incremental changes, but you reach a point where you don't have these huge leaps anymore. So I don't know. And should we even think that it is possible to do this, right? You know, can we really create a computer this advanced? Seems like we should be able to. I don't know. And I think there's a relationship here between the premises, right? Bostrom seems to think not only could a technologically advanced civilization create such simulations, he seems to think it would be pretty easy for them, right? But there's a lot of things we can do as a civilization that aren't easy, that we either don't do or don't do very often, right? So if it's really, really hard, if it takes a lot of resources to create simulations like this, then no civilization would probably have very many, right? Look, we can go to the moon. We can send people to the moon with 1960s technology. When's the last time we went to the moon, right? We can do it. It takes a lot of resources. We don't do it very often, right? If creating these kind of simulations took the better part of a country's budget, they wouldn't do it unless they had really good reasons, right? In that case, even if they could create those simulations, they might not ever do it. It might not be worth it. Or, they might only create a few. If they only created a few, well, instead of tens of thousands or millions, there might only be one or two around, in which case, still our odds of living in the real world wouldn't be great. 1 in 3, 1 in 4, not great odds. Might not be the likelihood that Bostrom thinks, right? So if it's really, really hard, that affects premise 3. They probably wouldn't create that many of these simulations even if they could do this. Why in the world would you want to do this? If it's just a video game, well, countries, scientific organizations, things with huge amounts of resources aren't going to create something just for the fun of it. They need to have an important reason. So if this is really hard, it wouldn't be like everyone's going to have a world running on his or her desktop. Now, there might be reasons to do it, learn important facts about history or behavior, but I don't know that it's just as natural as Bostrom seems to think that people are going to run a bunch of these simulations unless it just gets to the point it's so incredibly easy, any kid with the future equivalent of a laptop can do it. If that's the case, then there are probably thousands or millions of these. But if, on the other hand, creating a simulation like this is more on the order of going to the moon, there probably aren't that many, right? Or think of supercomputers, right? The government, the government and scientific institutions only have a few of those, or they only did back in the day. People had to fight over the uses of them because, so much people wanted to do with them. So I'm not quite as sure that it follows that if civilizations can do this, they're going to do it a whole bunch. That seems to assume not only can they do it, but it's pretty easy to do. Those seem to me rather different assumptions. All right. So next lecture we will finish off talking about the likelihood of this stuff or the other premises in Bostrom's argument.